If I asked you to picture like the absolute ultimate test of human athleticism, you might think of a marathon runner pushing through mile 26.
Or, maybe a gymnast sticking one of those seemingly impossible dismounts.
Right, exactly. But I want to challenge what you, the listener, consider a sport today. Because when you really start looking at what human beings have invented to test their physical limits, well, we have come up with some truly bizarre, slightly unhinged ways to compete.
That is definitely putting it mildly. I mean, when you zoom out and look at the sheer variety of human competition, it borders on the absurd sometimes.
Yeah.
We have this remarkable tendency to take a perfectly normal activity and just inject a completely unnecessary level of extreme difficulty,
Yes. Take chess boxing, for instance. It is literally exactly what it sounds like.
which is still hard to believe.
I know, right? You alternate 3-minute rounds of throwing actual punches in a boxing ring with 3-minute rounds of moving pawns on a chessboard. So you can win by knockout, or, you can win by checkmate. It's this jarring blender of sheer brawn and intense cognitive strategy.
And then how about bossa-ball? Somewhere along the line, someone looked at a traditional game of volleyball and thought, well, you know what this needs. Trampolines, a massive inflatable court, and live samba music playing in the background.
Obviously. Makes perfect sense.
Right. But it's fascinating because so many of these obscure sports isolate and weaponize very specific physical traits. Look at hurling in Ireland.
Oh, yeah?
It's often referred to as the fastest field sport on Earth, and it essentially isolates sheer acceleration and, frankly, sheer brutality. Or take kabaddi from India. It isolates agility, sure, but mainly it tests lung capacity. It's essentially a high-stakes, full-contact game of tag where the attacker has to physically hold their breath the entire time they're in enemy territory.
Wow. And then, of course, you have the competitions that genuinely just feel like a pub bet that got way out of hand.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm thinking of the Finnish wife carrying championship, where the reining technique is the Estonian carry. So the woman is slung upside down over the man's back, her legs crossed in front of his face, and the grand prize is literally her weight in beer.
That's amazing.
Or the absolute chaos of the English cheese rolling event at Cooper's Hill. I mean, you have dozens of people literally throwing their bodies down a near-vertical, extremely muddy cliff just to chase a 9-pound wheel of double Gloucester cheese.
Right. But, while chasing a wheel of cheese down a muddy hill is a fun, albeit highly injury-prone adrenaline rush, there is an entire discipline that takes that exact foundational premise, falling rapidly down a mountain, and turns it into a high-tech science.
A very dangerous science.
Very. It's a sport that pushes the human body and the human brain to the absolute outer limits of biology and physics. We are talking about downhill mountain biking.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We're going to explore how these athletes manage to willingly hurtle themselves down jagged rock faces and sheer drops at, up to 80 kilometers per hour.
Which is just insane to think about.
It is. So we want to understand the biomechanics of how the human body survives that kind of punishment, the predictive neuroscience required to steer at that speed, and, well, the psychology of why anyone would override their own survival instincts to actually do it.
The evolution of the sport is really the perfect place to start because it bridges that gap between, goofy pastime and high-tech gladiatorial combat, and it happened incredibly rapidly over just a few decades.
It really did. We have to go back to the 1970s, specifically Marin County, California. You have this group of hippies and bike enthusiasts, including the now legendary Gary Fisher, who decided it would be a thrill to just bomb down Mount Tamalpais.
Right, but they aren't riding anything resembling a modern sports bike.
Not at all. They are riding 1930s Schwinn Excelsior delivery bikes. These were heavy, virtually indestructible chunks of steel that they affectionately called clunkers.
And the defining event of that era perfectly captures the completely DIY, experimental nature of what they were doing. It was called the repack race.
The repack race.
Yeah. These clunkers didn't have the sophisticated disc brakes we see today, right? They had old-school coaster brakes, meaning you had to pedal backward to stop. The sheer friction generated from braking all the way down a steep, dusty mountain created so much intense heat that the grease inside the rear wheel hub would literally melt, boil, and vaporize.
Which means by the time they got to the bottom, the brakes were just completely destroyed.
Exactly. So after every single run down the mountain, the riders had to physically open up the hub of the wheel and literally repack it with fresh grease before they could safely ride again. Hence the name, the repack race.
That is just incredible.
Yeah.
But it's wild to contrast those heavy steel clunkers with the engineering of a downhill bike today. I mean, looking at the specifications from our sources, it's not even an exaggeration to say these modern bikes are the two-wheeled equivalent of Formula One cars.
They really are.
They're essentially high-performance motocross motorcycles, just without the engine. They are purely gravitational machines. For instance, they use a very specific frame geometry, most notably a 63-degree head angle.
And that head angle is crucial for survival. So the head angle is the angle of the front fork relative to the ground. A typical city bike has a steep angle, maybe 70 or 73 degrees, which makes it easy to turn at low speeds.
Right, for navigating traffic.
Exactly. But a 63-degree angle kicks that front wheel way out in front of the rider, much like a chopper motorcycle. This creates what's called a caster effect. At 80 kilometers per hour, that slack angle naturally forces the wheel to want to track perfectly straight.
Oh, I see.
It gives the bike immense stability so that when you slam into a boulder, the front wheel doesn't instantly violently twist to the side and just throw you off.
And the suspension systems are massive to handle those impacts. We're talking 200 millimeters of travel on a double-crown fork, which looks identical to what you'd see on a gas-powered dirt bike.
Yeah, that much suspension is entirely necessary to absorb drops from several meters in the air and to just plow straight through sections of the track they ominously call rock gardens.
Rock gardens, wow. But the brakes are where the engineering gets slightly terrifying. They run 200 to 220 millimeter hydraulic discs with 4-piston calipers, which I imagine means the stopping power is incredibly violent.
Violent is definitely the right word. The hydraulic pressure multiplies the force of the rider's fingers exponentially. The stopping power is so abrupt and so absolute that if you squeeze those brake levers too hard with just one single finger, the front wheel will lock dead.
Just one finger.
Just one finger. And the bike's momentum will pivot right around that front axle, and you will be instantly ejected straight over the handlebars.
I also noticed they've started mixing and matching the wheels, which they call the mullet setup.
Yes, the mullet.
Business in the front, party in the back. They put a massive 29-inch wheel on the front so it acts like a steamroller over large rocks and roots. But they keep a smaller 27.5-inch wheel on the back. That smaller rear wheel ensures the bike doesn't feel like driving a bus. It keeps it agile so they can whip the back end around in the air or through tight, steep corners.
Yeah, it's brilliant engineering.
But before we get to the human body, we need to clarify what kind of riding we're actually talking about here, because this sport is split into very distinct disciplines.
That's an important distinction because the rules, the environments, and frankly the consequences vary wildly. First, you have the UCI World Cup. This is the pure racing discipline. It's a race against the clock down a taped-off track. Athletes like the French champion Loic Bruni are hunting for fractions of a second. It's entirely about precision. The golden rule in racing is that you want your tires on the dirt as much as humanly possible, because when you are flying through the air off a jump, you cannot accelerate.
Right. Time spent in the air is time lost. But then you have freeride, which is the discipline that constantly goes viral on social media, the most famous event being the Red Bull Rampage, held in the absolute middle of the Utah desert.
And freeride is a completely different beast. There is no pre-made track. The riders are faced with a terrifyingly steep, crumbly sandstone mountain, and they and their big crews spend days physically carving their own lines into the cliff face.
That sounds exhausting before they even start riding.
Oh, it is. And they are regularly dropping off 20-meter vertical cliffs. To put that in perspective, that's roughly a 6-story building.
Insane.
There is no clock. It's a judged event based on the fluidity of the run, the difficulty of the midair tricks, and honestly, the sheer fact that they survived the descent.
And just to add one more layer of insanity to the mix, there's urban downhill. The most famous race is in Valparaiso, Chile. The riders are bombing full speed down incredibly narrow, steep city staircases, launching off rooftops, wall riding against apartment buildings, and literally actively dodging stray dogs in the streets.
It's wild to watch.
So really, comparing a UCI World Cup racer to a Red Bull Rampage freerider is like comparing an Olympic sprinter to a Hollywood stuntman. They might be using the same basic tool, but they are operating in a completely different universe of risk.
That is a perfect analogy. The physical profiles and the mentalities are just entirely different. A World Cup racer has massive explosive leg power to sprint out of corners and clinical surgical precision. A freerider is an aerial artist and a stunt performer. If you put a Rampage rider on a World Cup track, they will likely lose by 10 or 15 seconds, which in racing is an absolute eternity. Conversely, if you ask a World Cup racer to jump a 20-meter desert cliff, The vast majority will refuse because the risk of a career-ending injury or paralysis is simply too high for an event that doesn't even award world ranking points.
Though there are rare athletes, true extraterrestrials like the Canadian Brendan Semenuk, who have somehow managed to master and cross over between both worlds.
Yes, Semenuk is definitely the exception to the rule.
All of this incredible spectacle does raise a big question, though. Why isn't downhill mountain biking an Olympic sport? We already have cross-country mountain biking in the Summer Games.
It really comes down to the grueling logistics of extreme sports and the International Olympic Committee's requirements for fairness. First is just geography. For cross-country, you can bulldoze a small artificial hill in a park pretty much anywhere: London, Paris, Tokyo. But for downhill, you need a literal mountain with massive elevation and existing chairlift infrastructure. It's incredibly expensive to build a world-class televised track that a host city might only use for one single weekend.
And there's a huge issue with the weather ruining the fairness of the competition, too.
Exactly. Downhill is an individual time trial. One rider goes at a time over a couple of hours. If rider number 1 gets a dry track with bright sunshine, but rider number 20 gets hit by a sudden, massive rainstorm and high winds, the fairness of the competition is completely destroyed.
Right, because the mud changes everything.
The rain creates mud, the mud ruins traction, and the times are just no longer comparable. The IOC generally prefers mass start events where everyone faces the exact same conditions simultaneously. However, the culture of the host city matters, and there is a lot of optimism for the Brisbane Games in 2032, given Australia's massive, passionate mountain biking culture.
Okay, so we've established these bikes are gravitational super machines doing 80 kilometers an hour. Gravity's providing the engine. The rider isn't actually pedaling for the vast majority of the run. Which brings us to the biology. Why are these athletes so completely exhausted at the bottom of the hill? I mean, if I ride a fast roller coaster, the machine does the work. I'm not panting and sweating when I get off.
This is where we look at the intense biomechanics of the sport. The research presented by experts like Dr. Christophe Delong and Kinexa Formation provides a really fascinating breakdown of this.
Oh, perfect.
So in a sport like road cycling, the effort is cyclical and concentric. The muscles are constantly shortening as you pedal in rhythmic circles. But downhill isn't a cyclic effort. Because the rider is standing on the pedals, their legs are acting as the primary active biological suspension system.
Right, so they're absorbing the terrain before it even hits the bike suspension.
Exactly. Your quadriceps and your glutes are locked in a near-constant isometric squeeze just to maintain your standing position, while simultaneously being subjected to violent, high-speed shocks. From a biomechanical standpoint, according to Kinexa Formation, that is an eccentric effort. The muscle is actively lengthening while under an extreme heavy load.
Then it hurts.
Oh, it's brutal. That specific type of muscle contraction is a recipe for massive micro-tearing and severe delayed onset muscle soreness.
So it's essentially an anaerobic lactic sprint that lasts for 3 to 5 unrelenting minutes. Their bodies are just flooded with lactic acid. And it's not just the legs taking a beating. The core muscles are working overtime because these riders are pulling 3 to 5 Gs of force when they hit the banked dirt turns or berms at the bottom of a steep section.
And managing their center of gravity under those G-forces is literally everything.
Sure.
The biomechanics experts, like Dr. DeLong, highlight a critical technique called heels down. As a rider approaches a sharp corner and grabs those massive hydraulic brakes, they drop their heels far below the level of the pedals.
And for anyone who isn't a bike mechanic, why does the foot angle matter so much?
It entirely changes how the kinetic energy transfers into the bike. By dropping the heels, the massive forward momentum, the braking force, is channeled directly down through their stiffened legs and into the bottom bracket.
The bottom bracket.
The bottom bracket is the sturdy central axis where the pedal arms connect to the frame. If their feet were flat, that braking force would push their upper torso forward directly into the handlebars. Dropping the heels is the physical anchor keeping them from flying over the bars.
That makes perfect sense. But speaking of the handlebars, if you have these massive hydraulic brakes where a gentle squeeze can stop the bike, why is physically holding onto the grip so difficult? If you're going over rocks, can't you just tense your arms, grip as tight as possible, and hang on for dear life?
Doing that is the downhill rider's absolute worst nightmare. What you're referring to is the concept of stiffness control, and it's a delicate balancing act. Your arms have to act as living, breathing hydraulic dampers. If your arms are too rigid, if you grip the bars with 100% muscle contraction, Every single high-frequency vibration and rock strike is transmitted straight up the fork of the bike, through your rigid arm bones, into your collarbones, and directly into your skull. The vibrations are so intense that your vision will literally blur to the point where you cannot see the track.
Oh, wow. But if you go the other way and your arms are too loose and relaxed, the handlebars will just violently snap to the side and rip right out of your hand.
Precisely. So the triceps and biceps must co-contract. They have to dynamically, constantly adjust their stiffness, filtering out the high-frequency chatter of small rocks, but instantly firming up to absorb the massive, low-frequency impact of landing a jump. And this continuous, desperate, isometric death grip leads to a terrifying physiological failure known as arm pump.
Arm pump. The ticking clock inside every rider's forearms. How exactly does that happen?
It's essentially a vascular trap. Because the rider is squeezing the grips so hard for so long, the arterial blood, which is being pumped by a heart racing at 180 beats per minute, forces its way into the forearm muscles under high pressure. But the continuous muscle contraction is so incredibly tight that it physically pinches the lower pressure veins shut.
Wait, so the fresh blood gets pumped in, but the deoxygenated blood, which is now full of lactic acid and carbon dioxide, has no way out.
Yes, the forearms swell up and literally turn to stone. The internal pressure builds to the point where the nerves get compressed and stop firing correctly. The rider completely loses sensation in their hand.
That is terrifying.
It is. They physically cannot command their fingers to open and let go of the brakes, even if they desperately want to. To combat this, elite riders have learned to find microseconds while they are floating in the air off a jump to completely release their grip. They open their hands just enough to allow a split-second flush of trapped blood before grabbing the bars again right before the tires hit the dirt.
That is just wow. If your arms are absorbing all that shock and your eyes are dealing with all that vibration, human reaction time physically shouldn't be fast enough to steer at 80 kilometers an hour.
Sure.
How are they not crashing into the very first tree they see?
Well, they aren't relying on normal human reaction time. A normal human sees an obstacle, the brain processes it, and sends a signal to the arms. That takes about 100 to 200 milliseconds.
Which is pretty fast.
It is, but at World Cup racing speeds, 200 milliseconds means you've traveled several meters. By the time you react, you've already crashed. This is where the neurology of a champion rider is completely different. Their cerebellum operates on what neurologists call a forward model. The brain doesn't react to reality, it predicts it.
So they are basically prophesying the physics of the dirt. It's almost like their nervous system extends past their hands and feet directly down into the rubber of the tires.
That's a highly accurate way to visualize it. Through thousands upon thousands of hours of practice, their cerebellum has built a vast subconscious library of how different types of dirt, mud, and rocks feel and vibrate. When the bike begins to lose traction, a microscopic slip that a normal person wouldn't even detect yet, the rider's brain has already pre-activated the antagonist muscles to countersteer.
Before they even realize they're slipping.
Exactly. That correction happens via a fast spinal reflex loop before the conscious thinking part of the brain even registers that a slip occurred.
And it's not just one smooth movement either. The outer leg is actively pushing down on the pedal to find grip, but it's modulating that downward pressure 10 to 15 times a second. It's constantly, rapidly probing the dirt for the exact biting point of the tire.
And executing all of this requires perfect visual data. So how do you see clearly when your head is shaking violently? The brain relies on the vestibulo-ocular reflex, or VOR. The fluid in your inner ear detects the violent movements of your head and instantly commands the muscles in your eyes to move in the exact opposite direction at the exact same speed.
Like a natural Steadicam.
Exactly. It perfectly stabilizes the image on the retina, like a gimbal on a camera, allowing the brain to clearly process the ultra-fast optic flow of the passing landscape.
And while the eyes are doing that, the hands are performing incredible mental gymnastics. They call it finger dissociation. You have to keep your index finger incredibly soft and sensitive so you can perfectly feather those hair trigger hydraulic brakes. But at the same exact time, your other three fingers are clenching the grip with the force of a vice.
Right.
On the brain's motor cortex map, the neurons controlling those fingers are tightly linked. Actively separating their functions under extreme, life-threatening stress is a massive cognitive challenge.
And to make sure that cognitive processing power isn't wasted, the brain employs sensory gating. The physical impacts on the palms of the hands from the handlebars are excruciatingly painful. But if the brain actually processed those pain signals, it would be completely overwhelmed.
So it just ignores it.
Yep. The central nervous system deliberately ignores the pain signals from the hands, gating them out, to focus 100% of its processing power on traction, balance, and trajectory.
Which is an incredible feat of human biology,
Yeah.
right up until that predictive supercomputer makes a mistake.
Yeah, the mistakes are brutal.
That brings us to the darker reality of this sport. The psychology of the crash, the injuries, and the fear. What happens when that predictive brain makes a mistake?
The brutal, inescapable reality of downhill is that it's not a matter of if a rider will fall. It's a matter of when and what bones will break. The collarbone break is so common, it's almost a rite of passage. In fact, biomechanically, the collarbone acts as a biological fuse.
The fuse?
Yeah. When a rider is thrown over the bars, human instinct makes them put their arms out. The massive kinetic energy travels up the arm and intentionally snaps the collarbone, dissipating the deadly force before it can travel further and shatter the neck or the spine.
Oh, man. So the collarbone is just a routine injury. But the tragic injuries are terrifying. In racing, where they are navigating dense forests, the major risk is concussions riders hitting trees at 60 kilometers an hour. You look at our sources, and Camille Balanche, who is a famously precise and cautious rider, caught an unexpected gust of wind on a jump and suffered a horrific crash.
Right. And in freeride, where the risks are vertical drops, the injuries are catastrophic. You look at G. Atherton falling off a literal cliff and suffering multiple massive fractures, or Adolf Silva sustaining a severe spinal injury at the Rampage event.
Which brings us to the most perplexing psychological adaptation of these athletes. After experiencing a severe physical trauma, a normal human amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, creates a powerful overriding risk aversion to keep you alive. If you touch a hot stove, your brain ensures you never touch it again.
Right. That is basic human survival 101.
But these champions have to deliberately, consciously reprogram their amygdalas. They must train their brains to suppress that massive trauma response so they can go right back up the mountain, hit the exact same jump that broke their bones, at the exact same speed without a single millisecond of hesitation.
Because any hesitation on the brake lever at that speed changes the pitch of the bike, and that is fatal.
So the obvious question is why? Why override your own deeply ingrained survival instinct just to risk ending up in a wheelchair?
From a neurochemical standpoint, it is a literal addiction to survival. When you successfully survive a near-death experience, the brain releases a massive euphoric cocktail of endogenous opioids, things like dopamine and endorphins. Endorphins are structurally and chemically similar to morphine. They are the body's ultimate natural painkiller and reward system. The athletes become biologically hooked on this profound rush. To achieve it, they have to enter what sports psychologists call a flow state. This requires hypofrontality, which literally means shutting down the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, logic, and self-doubt. They are temporarily, voluntarily turning off the rational voice in their head that says, this is a terrible idea.
That level of risk does bring up some serious questions about the industry surrounding the sport, though. When looking at the literature, some sports analysts and medical professionals argue that there is a deep cynicism in the sponsorship model, particularly with extreme energy drink brands. They describe it as the marketing of hemoglobin.
Yes, the critical view is that these massive brands monetize vital risk to sell sugary drinks. From this perspective, it resembles modern gladiatorial combat. When the athlete successfully lands an impossible jump, the brand gets millions of views and massive engagement.
And if they don't?
Well, if the athlete crashes and shatters their spine, the brand still gets the viral buzz of the spectacular crash footage. The critics point out that the athlete alone bears the lifelong physical and psychological cost. And historically, when an athlete is broken, or if they simply become too cautious after a major trauma, the industry quickly replaces them with a younger, fearless rider who hasn't yet realized they are mortal. We're just reporting what the critics argue, but it is a sobering perspective.
It really is. So if critics are arguing that this system treats human beings as disposable, what is the alternative for someone who just wants to appreciate the incredible skill of mountain biking without the ethical baggage of the extreme danger?
If you want to witness absolute, breathtaking mastery of gravity in the bicycle without the suicidal speeds, many enthusiasts point toward trials riding.
Ah, like the viral videos from Danny McCaskill.
Exactly. Trials biking is slow, deliberate, and incredibly precise. It's about hopping the bike along narrow fences, riding across thin cables, and scaling vertical walls from a complete standstill. It celebrates total balance, patience, and neuromuscular control, but it completely removes the violent, life-threatening kinetic energy of downhill racing.
We have definitely covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with people throwing themselves down a hill for cheese and arrived at athletes who have quite literally hacked their own neurochemistry. When you add it all up, a downhill champion is effectively a positive biological aberration.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, they are masterful physicists, their cerebellums are predictive supercomputers, their limbs function as living hydraulic dampers, and they have successfully reprogrammed their own fear response.
They truly are a testament to the absolute extreme limits of human physical and mental adaptation.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. We just spent a lot of time talking about how these athletes deliberately reprogram their amygdala to shut off the terror of a 20-meter cliff so they can achieve a flow state. But what about us? In our daily lives, we constantly let our amygdalas flood our bodies with cortisol and anxiety over unread emails, awkward social interactions, and project deadlines. Things that, objectively speaking, will not kill us. If a downhill biker can train their brain to completely ignore the terror of a sheer drop into a rocky canyon, what imaginary cliffs could you train your brain to ignore tomorrow?